Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to another exciting virtual tour with the Foss Waterway Seaport. I'm, of course, your guide this evening, Chris, with Pretty Gritty Tours and, of course, the Seaport. And tonight, we are exploring the legacy of Earl and Floyd Willits, who were most famous, of course, for making the finest wooden canoes the world has ever seen. And tonight we are going to do a couple things. One, you get to be here for the premiere of a piece of this documentary that I'm working on for the Seaport, showcasing the boat shop. And the boat shop is really the star of the show tonight. As you're about to discover, it was the facility where Earl and Floyd Willits created all of their canoes out on Day Island. And they made, I believe it was 918 canoes over the course of their life. And at one point, Floyd died quite suddenly. And Earl was left in the boat shop trying to continue that business that he and his brother had been doing together since high school. And it didn't work out. And there was one last canoe that was made in the Willits shop after Floyd passed on. And it's still in there. So the magic of this boat shop, right, is that after Floyd dies, Earl tries to carry on the legacy, isn't satisfied with the work that's done on that last canoe, and just closes the shop, leaves, a part of a canoe on a form and a mold in there, then leaves the tools on the bench and just walks out, locks the door, leaves it right there, and lives in the house next to it for the remainder of his life until, of course, he dies in the 1960s. And since that time, it has just been there on Day Island like a time capsule or a tomb with all of the Willits legacy left inside of it. And we're going to get to see that tonight and a little bit of this, and we're going to talk about the Willits. So if you guys have questions, please let me know. But yeah, thank you. I'm excited for this too. It's huge, and I'm hoping that I've prepared for it. So first and foremost, why don't we take a look at what we've been working on? In the small community of Day Island, just on the side of Tacoma, Washington, there is a single business that has operated since the early 1900s. It is an unassuming boat shop that's been shuttered for decades, but in its prime, they created the finest canoes that the world has ever seen. Wooden canoes made by hand by a single pair of brothers, Earl and Floyd Willits. But what happened to this legacy?
Close the doors, and it's like a sound stage or a warehouse of materials on a Hollywood soundstage. You just kind of mothball it and let it sit. So one good thing about that is everything was preserved. It's like opening the pyramids, and you hear see some Egyptian sarcophagus or something been there for thousands of years. Unfortunately, it wasn't 1,000 years, but kind of that feeling of this is just a slice in time of. You could almost see Earl and Floyd walking around in here.
As soon as the Foss Waterway Seaport Museum acquired rights to the Willits collection, they set about the daunting task of cleaning, curating, and cataloging the entire contents of this boat shop, which had been sealed for decades. Each new layer they peeled back revealed a little bit more of the secrets of who were Earl and Floyd Willits, and how did they make such masterful pieces of art. What was so extraordinary is that everything had been left exactly the way it was when Earl walked out the door. From the machines, to the tremendous amounts of lumber and the molds and the shapes and the forms. There are even canoes mid-progress that hang from the ceiling, left untouched since the last time Earl and Floyd Willits handled them. It's a testament and a time capsule that remembers the time when Willits canoes were produced by hand on Day Island. all of these tools and jigs and molds were left exactly the way they were the day that Earl walked out the front door. And to interpret their use and this time, we are forced to rely on experts like Pat Chapman. Pat Chapman is a man who has dedicated so much of his life to understanding the practices and the lives of the Willits brothers. But of course, that begs the question, what originally stoked his curiosity?
I wound up inheriting my grandfather's Old Town wood canvas canoe that I learned to canoe in, and I learned how to fix it up. And then I determined that I wanted to kind of have a hobby business. So I formed my own canoe business, McFarland Lake Canoe Company. And in the process of that, I became exposed to Willits canoes at either boat shows, or I would be showing canoes, and so my first one I saw, somebody in Olympia had a Willits canoe that was damaged and wanted me to look at it and see if I could fix it up. So from there, I just became more and more exposed to Willits canoes. And then there was a group that I belonged to through the Wooden Canoe Heritage Association. There's a local chapter. Lon Willits, the Earl and Floyd's nephew, came and talked to that group about Earl and Floyd, and I became fascinated. So then I wanted to learn more about themselves and their canoes, and it just skyrocketed from there.
You could say that he literally wrote the book on the Willits.
5 years researching and writing the book, published a book on the Willits brothers and their canoes, dealt with their family history, their lives, and the canoes and the business itself.
Going through the boat shop has allowed historians to begin to unpack the rumors about the life and times of Earl and Floyd Willits. Always a secretive duo, so little is actually known about who they were and what they did to create these canoes, but we've begun to understand a little bit more about them. We know that they graduated from Tacoma High School, which is now known as Stadium High School, and went on to create canoes for the entirety of their lives here on Day Island, where their boat shop still stands. But who were Earl and Floyd as people? And, most importantly, is it true that they firmly disliked one another?
That's one thing. I just more conjecture than anything. I interviewed a number of people that, and family members as well as friends. Some people say that they just didn't get along because Floyd worked upstairs and Earl worked downstairs, but they lived together for essentially their whole adult life. It's probably like any kind of long-term relationship or marriage where you kind of get settled into a pattern and you get along as you need to. But they vacationed together, they lived their lives together. So I think they were as close as brothers could be, but they had their own private time as well. Particularly Earl, the stories is Earl was the taciturn one, and he didn't really visit with visitors, and more of a serious mode. He did all the correspondence, and you read his correspondence, it's all businesslike. Whether he was that way in his off time or not, I don't know. Floyd was, by all accounts, would be the one who would, if they showed anything in the shop, Floyd would be the one taking people around. But I've talked to people who were kids and they'd wander around in the office and the brothers were very friendly with them. So take whatever you think is correct. I'm not sure.
Whether they got along or not, one thing is abundantly clear from the boat shop. They went through great pains to separate their independent spheres. The bottom floor is entirely Earl's, and the upper floor is all Floyd's. And they went through lengths so far as even installing a little dumbwaiter to allow the phone to come up and down the levels without interacting with each other.
And the phone comes up and down.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
There's a passion and fanaticism to those who have interacted with Willits canoes, but what is it exactly that makes them so spectacular and world-renowned?
A couple things. One is that they're all wood, just gorgeous wood inside and out, which most canoes in later years were wood canvas until aluminum and fiberglass came along. So just the beauty of the wood, but also the way they built them. They designed the canoe themselves, they manufactured it with tools that they developed and techniques they developed. And they're kind of a unique style of construction. There's 2 layers of wood separated that contain a waterproof cotton muslin layer in between, which is, most canoe builders didn't do it that way because it's labor intensive, expensive to do, and difficult unless you have all the machining and things that they had here.
But the Willits brothers did have everything they need. Something that becomes abundantly clear as soon as you enter the boat shop is that this place was perfectly designed for the sole purpose of creating canoes that are works of art.
So they had everything labeled, everything in its place. They had jigs and templates so that they could make every part exactly the same. So that when it left the downstairs and went up to Floyd, Floyd could fit it without having really to do much manipulation to get a perfectly fit piece. And they were so perfectionist that they would make sure it fit. So it's amazing to see the organization and the methods they used and try and figure out how they did that. They essentially did everything themselves. All the metal parts that they made, so like the painter ring up above, they did that, had jigs to make that. The metal materials they molded so that they could take it to a foundry and have them cast. They did so much of this themselves. Now they didn't make the screws, they bought screws, but pretty much everything else they built themselves.
The process of making a canoe was exquisite and elegant inside the Willits boat shop. After Earl would machine down the pieces of lumber, he would send them upstairs to his brother Floyd, who would strap them to a shape or a mold. Clamping them down to give that wood its initial shape, he would steam it into position and then take a series of copper tacks and nails, driving them into the steel shape you see here, which would effectively rivet them by bending the other end. From there, they would finish up with brass screws, creating this beautiful piece of art known as a Willits canoe. So obviously they are gorgeous, but they only made just over 900 in their lifetime. How do you make a living with just making 900 canoes?
That's one thing I've not figured out. They built 918 canoes over the years. They worked all the way through the Depression. They were always in business except during 2 world wars. And well, for one thing they built new canoes. They weren't super expensive. They were reasonably priced, but they also did repairs. And I think repairs were more lucrative for them. But beyond that, I don't know, because they had a good living. They had property across the water. They had the property here. And when they died, they had savings. They had, what they could live on. So I don't know. They didn't have children, so they were married later in life. And they lived together basically their whole lives, except for when Earl was married for 10 years. He lived in Tacoma with his wife. But other than that, they lived together. So they shared expenses. They were frugal. But beyond that, I don't know. I've not been able to figure that out.
One of the most magnificent parts of this project, though, is finally getting answers to questions that people have had for generations about what was the Willits process. And it's an exciting time now to go through their catalogs and collections and get to see the intimate details of their work.
Yeah. For me, it's interesting and frustrating as well, because I tried to get in, when I was working on my book, I wanted to get as much information about how they built the canoes, so I couldn't get in here and see this. So now that I see it, and I see a lot of questions answered that I had in writing the book that I couldn't get the answers to then. Now I can see some of it, but part of the problem that we have now is that even though they recorded a lot of things, there's templates, there's jigs, there's things that I can't yet figure out how they use them and what everything is for. So some of that, unfortunately, is probably going to be lost to history because we just don't know how they did it, which is too bad because they were unique in how they built canoes. Other canoe manufacturers didn't build canoes the way they do. And it would be nice to know as best we can. So I'm looking forward to getting at the collection once it's over in the warehouse at the museum, to try and sort out some of the stuff of how they did it.
With the tools left where they were, you get an intimate snapshot of what the process was like, and it's easier to understand just how meticulous the Willits brothers were about each individual canoe.
They took such meticulous care in how they constructed those. For example, most canoes, not all of them, most of the canoes, the wood was book matched, which just means that when they saw a piece of wood, they saw it in half, you fold it over, and they're essentially mirror images of the same thing. And so they would put one piece of that book matched on one side, one on the other. So you look on both sides of the canoe, they're mirror image. You didn't have to do that for a solid, functional canoe, but that's just what was beautiful to them. If you look at a canoe that hasn't been altered, when they put screws in, they always made sure that the screw heads, the slots of the screws lined up to the line of the canoe. And so if you look at the screws on the bow, the screw heads would alternate according to the curve of the bow. Again, they didn't have to do that for a quality canoe, but they always went over and above everybody else.
It's important to remember, though, that while the tools and the jigs and the machines were left exactly how the Willits dropped them in the 1960s, there were decades that went by where this was just an empty boathouse, used occasionally for family storage. And all of those ages piled up on top of what was left.
This was always the holy grail to come in and see. Lon Willits, who was their nephew, owned the building at the time, and he was really reluctant to let anybody in here and see anything. They're very closed off into what they would let people see. So he let me in here for 15 minutes. And yes, it was kind of a dream come true, but also a bit of a nightmare, because the family of 3 generations or so had used this kind of as a storage area. And so there was mounds and mounds and mounds of stuff from the family, you name it, was stored in here. And so I couldn't really get a sense of what the factory would have looked like when it was active. Downstairs was really bad. I couldn't see anything, any of the machinery or anything. Upstairs was a bit better because you could see the building form and some things. I got an inkling of what it was like, but for years after, really dying to get in here and see it. So when the museum finally acquired the factory contents from the family, and I got in here, and as it's being cleaned up, it's amazing. It's amazing. Like I say, I'd like to live here for a week or two and try and sort things out.
Today, the boat shop on Day Island has been covered up by protective siding. But if you were to remove it, the original exterior and signage is still underneath. In its heyday as a productive boat shop, though, it would have been filled with natural light, almost entirely covered with windows to allow the Willits brothers to work.
This shop on Day Island was built with their father. The father was a contractor carpenter in Tacoma, built houses that still stand today in Tacoma. So their father helped them build this factory. They bought kind of the last building lots on the south end of the island, and they built this. It was 2 stories, is 2 stories. Initially there wasn't electricity, so they had to have windows throughout. Windows on all sides, top and bottom. So they had natural light. They'd have shades that they could diffuse the light if they needed to when they're working. But it was designed by them, and they had the milling materials, machinery downstairs along with the office and the showroom. And then here was the assembling, upstairs was assembling, and behind us was a finish room and then a storage room. So they had everything they needed here. Eventually put in electricity. The machinery was run off a belt drive system. You didn't just plug it into AC power and go. You had I'm not sure what, currently it's electric belt drive. Whether it would have gas powered before that, I'm not sure. But the factory met all their needs from 1920 until finally Earl died in 1967. It's been here since.
But now we have to discern what happened. Floyd died first, and Earl tried to carry on the business afterwards, but it didn't stick.
So the problem was that when Floyd died, then Earl didn't know really how to put the canoes together to the extent that Floyd did. And so there really wasn't a way to keep the business going, because they just didn't want anybody to come in and do the work for them, primarily probably because they wanted to maintain the quality and they didn't think anyone was qualified enough to do that. Of course, they didn't hire anybody to teach them how to do it, so it's kind of self-fulfilling prophecy.
Today, of course, we're just left to wonder. By going through the stacks of copper nails and the machines that the Willits brothers invented for the sole purpose of making canoes, we can contextualize what was going on inside the workshop, but the nuance of the process is lost forever. There's a lot of speculation that because the labor was so divided between pre-production and assembly, that Earl wasn't able to do what Floyd was.
So it was really sad to see that when Floyd died, Earl was struggling. And he made promises, yes, he was going to continue the business, but he just couldn't do it. And he was older as well. His health was failing eventually, and he just couldn't do it. So when I've seen pictures and talked to people who came in after Floyd died, and Earl let them in and maybe sold them a few parts, but said, I just can't do it myself, so the business is just going to die away.
When you're inside the boat shop, it is not difficult to envision how meticulous and fine-tuned these brothers were at their decided process. The notes go on for days about how they would machine down the lumber, take it upstairs, and create the canoes. And each drawer, each section is independently labeled and numbered and matches up with every other part. There are literal signs throughout the entirety of the boat shop, handwritten by the Willits brothers, that give you a very clear idea of who they were as artists and builders. They were in a constant quest to be the best version of themselves that they could be.
The family donated the papers that are contained in the factory and the family. They donated that to Tacoma Library, so I helped with some of that. In looking at some of those records, they kept records of people that had contacted them interested in working for them. So there's a list of a dozen people or so, names of people who are interested in coming to do this. They never hired anybody outside of Lon that they had come in for a few summers when he was a young teenager. They never had any help. The upper canoe is the last one that was ever built, number 965. And it was built by Earl and Lon, Earl's nephew, after Floyd died. And the story on that one is that Earl and Lon struggled with putting that together because, again, Earl built the parts downstairs, sent them up to Floyd to put the canoe together. Earl wasn't experienced in all the tricks of the trade of how to put that canoe together because Floyd wasn't here. And so I can see some defects in the construction. Even though it's still a gorgeous Willits Brothers canoe, it didn't meet Earl's demanding satisfaction. So Lon tells a story that Earl really wanted to take it out in the back and burn it because he wasn't satisfied with it. Lon convinced him, no, let's save this. No one will ever see it, but we'll have it to be the last one. We'll just never use it. And so that's what happened. So I just peeked inside. It's number 965. There's a mint condition carpeting that they built. That was one of the options they could make. There is one of the upholstered seat backs and an outboard motor mount in there. But it's apparently it's never been in the water, and it's just gorgeous. But I can see some of the quality is not there that Floyd would have put into it.
For me, when I look at the crooked screws and multiple nails out of place on the last canoe ever made, and compare them to all the other canoes that the Willits brothers made together, I have to envision that Earl, after having lost his brother whom he lived with and worked with for the entirety of his life, found it difficult to return to the spot where they had been together forever and tried to do the work that his brother was doing by hand. The heartbreak must have been overwhelming. And while a lot of people speculate that Earl was simply dissatisfied with the work, I personally have to think that the emotion was overwhelming.
There is an account, after Floyd died, one of their friends, acquaintances or something, wrote a letter to the editor in the Tacoma paper talking about Floyd and the brothers and how they built essentially Stradivarius quality canoes compared to violins. So if you look at this, then they really are, there's a combination of their quality of the craftsmanship is so incredible, but it's not just, it is a functional canoe, and they're meant to be used in the water. They're very strong, but they're also very beautiful. Nothing else looks like that. So some people now that have Willits canoes, they don't use them. They display them in their house as works of art, which they really are. And they're all numbered. They didn't sign them, but they're numbered, so you know what they are. But
so there you have it, a little slice of what we're working on with that, and it showcases, I think, the project the Seaport is working on right now. So they acquired the rights to the Willits collection and came in and effectively took everything out of the boat shop, put it into a storage facility, and are now going through and curating that collection for display and loan, and to allow people like Pat to really get in and experience the Willits legacy, as it were. Because for the most part, what people have interacted with over the years are the canoes themselves. Like Pat said, there were 918 canoes that were ever produced by the Willits brothers. And they were produced at a time where canoeing was, prime. I love this picture. But a lot of the canoes were actually used out here in the Tacoma area. And there's no shortage of photographs of people arriving like this with their Model A's or Model T's to rope up the canoes that they purchased onto the side of their vehicles and take off. And if you are interested, you don't have to be interesting, just interested to see them, there's a tremendous collection of Willits canoes at the Foss Waterway Seaport. Hopefully you guys got a chance to go on their free Third Thursday today and take a look at some of these. And so, yeah, I don't know. And why choose, right? What was so cool about these Willits pieces of art, right, is that they are incredibly durable, that they are functional canoes. And so like I've gotten to check out a few of them, and you can take them out and like they work really well to this day. And because of that like durability in the wood, you have something that 100 years later is still a very functional and usable canoe. And with the introduction of that waterproof muslin layer in between the two layers of wood, you really just create something that lasts forever. What I like about them too is that, when you would normally have something with like a frame and then the painted canvas or sealed canvas on the exterior of a canoe, it's much more likely to have an incident where there's a tear or a puncture, right? But with that double layered wood, I mean, you're effectively making something bomb-proof, and they're just so pretty. What's really interesting about these two, and Pat touched on this a little bit, is that they made each of them by hand, but that they made them identical. So over the years, and I know they switched up the model occasionally as they innovated, but they kind of dialed in right away in the start. But models, whatever, 500 through 900 were exactly the same. And they would put in features like they would pre-drill pilot holes and then hide them under different parts of the canoe. So if later you bought just a standard model, but then you went back and you're like, you know what? I was wrong. I would really like a sail kit. They wouldn't have to retrofit your canoe at all. You could just buy the additional pieces and they would already fit into the canoe that they made. So they made every single one of their canoes to be compatible with anything that they sold. And going through the boat shop right now, curating that collection, there's a back room where they had paddles and oars, seat backs, sail kits, fin keels, all of those additional add-ons that they would sell. And you could see how they just click right into anyone. It was essentially like the Lego brand of canoes. Any piece you got would be compatible with any other piece that you bought down the road, and everything would fit onto your canoe no matter at what point you bought it. Another thing that Pat talks about in the longer length documentary that I'm working on is the introduction of the serial number. So they stamped each of their canoes to prevent theft, or to eventually prove that it was their canoe later on if they needed to. And because they didn't want people to get wise to that, they never told anybody about this. But not only did they, like if it was canoe 901, right? Not only would they stamp 901 with their die set all throughout the different pieces of it in hidden locations and visible locations, but they also used dots, almost like the dots that you would see on a domino, and would put secret patterns throughout it. And it would be a 901, so that they always had that serial number all throughout the canoe in different pieces there. So if they ever had to prove that it was an actual Willits canoe or one that had been stolen and taken somewhere else, they could do it by going to those secret locations, which I think is really phenomenal. Just the amount of foresight that they put into it. When you look at the canoes today, I can't decide which side is more impressive to me. The fact that they machined down, all of these pieces, right? So you've got Earl in the first floor of the canoe shop, and he would take raw lumber, often milled from the area, machine it down into these pieces that were compatible with every other canoe that they ever made. And then it would go upstairs to Floyd, who would assemble it onto those forms, molds, and shapes that he had upstairs. And one of the things that's extra cool to me is that the boat shop itself was designed almost like a transformer. So you could kind of see a little bit on the shot of the staircase there. A lot of those pieces had wing nuts on them, or slots and grooves. And so you could disassemble the staircase to allow a boat to come down it if it were too big for that opening there, or things would fold out or collapse into the walls. Like almost everything was a Murphy bed workbench. And when you go throughout that space, right, plastered with the signs that a tool put away is a tool found, every inch of that space was manufactured and designed by them to fit their needs and desires. Today, there are discussions about what should be done with it. So obviously, it is an incredibly important historic location to the area. It's, like I mentioned earlier, the only business that's allowed on Day Island. So they were permitted early on to operate as a business on Day Island, which doesn't allow brick and mortar businesses on the island anymore. And the Willets, just because they were part of that community, campaigned to maintain their presence there throughout everything, right? The Depression, World War I, World War II, they were there. And today that space is going to remain. And there's discussion about what it's going to actually be. And I can't talk confidently about what it's going to end up, but it will continue to be a part of the community and represent it there. And I think that they're going to take that siding off of it, re-exposing the original exterior of it, and turn it back into that sort of beautiful structure there, putting all of those windows back in. So there will be a ton of natural light in there. From there, it's still owned by the Willits family. What's going to happen to it is still a moment of some debate. What we do know confidently, though, is that entire collection of lumber, tools, jigs, pieces that the Willits brothers machined down and had ready to be installed in canoes will all be moved into the Foss Waterway Seaport archive. And from there, they can curate a collection for it, display it either in the seaport itself or have a collection on loan for people who would like to display it as part of maritime history throughout the Pacific Northwest. Because the Willits legacy, right, is intrinsically Tacoma, but also goes beyond just our boundaries here. I think it's something that is ubiquitous in the area. And 918 wooden canoes is not a lot, but the biggest majority of them are still in this region right now, and predominantly in the Foss Waterway Seaport. So if you want to see them, that's the spot to go, including their only launch that they ever made. I believe they made this for personal use, but the Willits brothers designed this runabout boat so that they could get to places like their property across the water, or just take care of stuff, because they lived on Day Island, right? They were right down there on the water. So they had the capacity to just create something for themselves to run about. But when you see the original boat shop, right, it's there on the water. What's cool about this shot is that little shed that's up on the pillars there, that's the location of the Willits home today. Still owned by the Willits family, but that was the house that Earl and Floyd lived in together for decades. And they could walk right out the front door, take, I don't know, 6 steps, and then go into the workshop itself. Did the Seaport acquire the original building as well? No. So the original boat shop is still under the ownership and control of the Willits family. Just all of the contents that Earl and Floyd owned are now under the jurisdiction of the Foss Waterway Seaport Museum. And so the discussion of how best to curate that collection and display it is where the Seaport is going. And that's more or less where I've kind of entered into this discussion about doing more virtual cataloging of it and making sure that there is a accessible storyline for people wherever they are, and to really sort of document that process. Because when they first walked in, right, it's volunteers from the Seaport who had to go through and just wade through decades of life and separate what was Willits that came after from what was Willits that was before, and then to move. I think they went through something like 35 to 40 truckloads of virgin timber from the Pacific Northwest that was sitting in this boat shop, some of it from the early 1900s. And to just maintain that, I think, when you think about the pricelessness of the artifacts that they went through, it's absolutely staggering. For me, though, it's that final canoe. And the same way that there is something that makes something more intrinsically valuable because of its flaws, I think that final canoe is perhaps the most priceless artifact from the Willits legacy. And like I said, I can't help but humanize the situation. I know there's so much discussion about Earl as the consummate perfectionist, just being unwilling to accept this canoe wasn't to this standard that he and his brother worked on. But I'm like, how could it possibly? How could it possibly, when you are a person who has been together with him? They weren't from Tacoma originally, but they came of age in this area, graduated from high school here, started building boats together. And that was not just their profession, but their entire life. They lived on the water and used these boats and built them together. And so to go back to that spot, not just where he had lived and worked, but where Floyd had died, and try and pick up from that moment, to pick up his tools and finish his job, seems like a Herculean lift. And I don't think that anyone could have really been equal to that task, because it wasn't machined. It wasn't as simple as like, oh, we got to turn on the bandsaw and mill something down. He had to replicate the motion and the artistry of his brother, his other half, whom he lost. So I don't know. From there, there's going to be a lot of Willits in your future if you're interested. I hope that you guys take this opportunity to go down to the Foss Waterway Seaport, interact with those exhibits, and get to see it. And if you haven't yet, go now and appreciate the canoes that they do have currently there with new eyes. And when you look and see, like Pat was saying, just the little detail, like the fact that each of those screws, right? So it's got the slot in it. And as it goes down the bow, it curves with the canoe. And so everything is streamlined. Each of the copper tacks is perfectly spaced from all the others and matches up like a constellation chart with every other canoe that they made. And like I said, getting to see the imperfections, the human element in that final canoe, it gave me chills at the time, honestly, just getting to see that. and it's still in the boat shop. So unless the Seaport has moved it, which they may have finally done, once Earl and Lon finished that final canoe, they hung it on the wall, put its death shroud over it, that canvas cover, and it was never seen. Directly underneath it, what you got to see in the documentary there was the show model. It's in the 400 number of canoes that they manufactured. And that one was the one that Earl and Floyd would show off to people to show them, oh, this is kind of what you're getting into. And it was decked out with all the cool features. So you could see the sail kit, the keel, the gunnel bumpers, everything down there so that you could kind of get an idea for what you wanted to mix and match on your Willits canoe. Directly above the showroom model, though, is that hidden one, the forgotten one, which I just would be devastated if he had given it its funeral pyre, taken it out and back and burned it. Returning its ashes to the sea would have been cataclysmic, I think, for those who are invested in the Willits history and legacy. So hopefully there will be more, right? Now we'll be able to get to see that boat shop sort of buffed back up to its original luster. And if you ever go to Day Island, you'll get to see it out there in its glory. For the contents of that space, it'll then be on display in the museum, and we'll get to see a little bit more of that shined up out in the area. Great question. How long did it take them to make a single canoe? There is speculation, and I think it really was just dependent on their temperament. And I think Pat would be able to obviously answer this better than I can, but I think anywhere from like 2 weeks to a month. But if they were really focused in on it, they could churn one out really quickly. Which again, I'm like, 918 canoes working from 1900 to 1967, right? And that's not a lot of canoes. And I don't know if you got to see the price sheet there. For a Willits canoe in 1928, I believe it was $100 for the base model, 17 feet long, 31 inches across. And it's astounding. I can't wrap my head around it. And the fact that Pat was baffled by it as well was satisfying to me, because I was like, I don't understand how you only create those 918 canoes and make a living off of it. But they did it. And like Pat was saying, a lot of it could have been that they were just accomplished as shipwrights and boat builders. And so you could bring them anything and they would be able to repair it. And while their great passion and conviction was in the creation of their own product, so much so that they created every piece and tool that they needed because they needed it to be specifically the way they wanted it. They were flexible enough and talented enough that they could work on anything. So, Melinda, why would you burn it? What a crime against humanity. So from there, if you guys have questions, please let me know. Stay tuned. I'm not sure at what point we are going to be releasing this full documentary. That's up to the brass at the Seaport, but it should be coming out hopefully soon. And we'll get to look a little bit more in depth about what it takes to make a career like this float. So other than that, please let me know. I'm always here to answer your questions, comments, and concerns. And I appreciate you guys coming out tonight and learning a little bit more about Earl and Floyd Willits and what really made these guys tick. Until next time, my friends, please stay curious, keep on exploring, and I will see you out there. Enjoy your night.